and after that, I think it will be a question and answer session. Uh, Now, this is a heterogeneous audience, as you can guess. Not all of them are from scientific background. Therefore, my questions will be of general nature, and Dr. Meva Singh, being a scientist, will pose questions with the advantage of his scientific background. So the idea is to reach the content of the book, Why We Die, to the audience so that they are inspired to read the book on their own at their leisure. And there are 12 chapters in our book, Dr. Ramakrishna. My idea is to cover all the chapters as far as possible, posing one question each. Let's see how it goes. Now, Dr. Meva Singh will have something to say.
Okay, before we start with the book, Venki, it is general curiosity in the people about your work which earned you Nobel Prize, because the work is not going to be reflected much in the book, what you have done. And I know it's very, very technical work, not to explain what he has summarized, explain in a simple language to this kind of mixed audience about your basic work. Then we'll get to the book.
Okay, so actually, my own research is on how the body makes proteins. And the way when you tell an ordinary person, a non-scientist about proteins, they usually think proteins are something you need to eat to grow strong, or they think proteins are something that you need for muscles. But they don't realize that proteins actually are the workhorses of life. Almost everything that you see in life is due to proteins. That gives life its unique characteristics. For example, the way we see is due to a protein in our eyes that detects light. If you touch something and you sense heat or even touch, that's because there are protein receptors that can sense pressure or heat, that convey signals to your brain. The way you carry oxygen from your lungs through your blood to your tissues is a protein called hemoglobin. It's one of the first proteins whose structure was determined. So what are these proteins? Well, they're long chains, they're polymers, long chains with building blocks called amino acids. And there are about 20 types of amino acids. And by various combinations, these protein chains will have a unique characteristic. The order of the amino acids will automatically determine how the proteins fold up and have a particular function. Now imagine how miraculous this is. Imagine how miraculous this is. It's almost as if you had strips of paper and, it's too loud. It's almost as if you had strips of paper and you wrote a different sentence on each strip. And based on what you wrote, the strip of paper would fold itself up into a unique shape. That's how amazing it is, but it's of course due to the chemical properties of amino acids. So I've told you a lot about proteins, and by the way, antibodies that we use to fight viruses, they're also proteins. So enzymes that digest our food are also proteins. So you can see proteins have a huge range of functions, and every one of them is a polymer of amino acids, and the protein is made using instructions present in our genes. So our genetic information is what tells the cell how to make the protein, which is how to specify the particular order of those building blocks that goes to make the protein. Now, this doesn't happen automatically. Rather, what happens is our genes typically reside on DNA. There are some organisms in which the genome is made of RNA, typically viruses. But most life forms use DNA as their genetic material. But the DNA is not read directly to make really bad feedback here. It's too loud, okay? Either that or you need to switch off this thing. So, anyway, the way that the genetic information is read to make proteins is by first copying the gene, that is a section of the DNA that contains the gene for that particular protein, into an intermediate molecule called mRNA. Now, many of you have heard of the mRNA COVID vaccines, and which has saved millions of lives. And what that mRNA had is the instruction for how to make the spike protein of coronavirus. And because it could make the spike protein, the immune system would recognize it and react to it. And then when you got infected by a real virus, it would have already been programmed to recognize that spike protein from the real virus and mount an immune reaction. But it's this mRNA, which is a copy, that's made into a protein, and that also doesn't happen by itself. It requires this enormous molecular complex, which is about 500,000 atoms and consists of two parts, a large and a small subunit. And that particle is called the ribosome. And it is what reads the mRNA to make proteins. And that's how each of the thousands of proteins in your body is made. So the gene is copied to mRNA, and then the ribosome reads the mRNA to make those proteins. And although the ribosome was discovered in the 1950s, it wasn't until sort of late 90s and early 2000s that we had a detailed understanding of what the ribosome looked like. And there's a fringe benefit to this work, which is that bacteria have ribosomes also. All life forms actually have ribosomes. But their ribosomes are slightly different from ours, with the result that you can have compounds that block bacterial ribosomes, but don't block our own ribosomes. And many of those are useful antibiotics. For example, erythromycin or azithromycin or tetracycline, or streptomycin. These are all what we call ribosomal antibiotics. They work by blocking bacterial ribosomes. So that in a nutshell is sort of this work that you alluded to. But I just want to point out that it does have a connection with aging, because as we age, our ability to make proteins at the right time and in the right amount, and also to destroy proteins when they're dysfunctional, declines. So this whole sort of field of protein synthesis and its regulation actually is quite important for aging itself, even though I don't personally work on aging.
Thank you. Before Naganna takes over, I want to start with the title of your book. Can you said, aging. The title of your book is Why We Die. As I understand, the whole book is basically about aging. What you are talking about is how do we age. So why I am asking this, because many people, including some biologists nowadays, they make this slogan like, we don't die of age, we die of a disease. We die of a disease which could be age related, but nobody dies of age. So this, would you clarify in the beginning, whether you see dying or aging as the same process, or aging is something different than dying?
I think that you could, of course, you can die of many reasons. For example, you can die of an accident, you can die of an infectious disease, you can die if somebody murders you, lots of ways to die. Okay? But let's suppose you avoid all of those external things. You're very careful and practice hygiene, you don't get infections, you don't, and so on, and you're lucky that you don't get cancer. You will still die, right? And so you could think of death as inevitable. It's not that you can avoid these various causes and then you'll be immortal. death is inevitable. And what is that inevitability due to? It's due to the fact that we age. And so I think of aging as a gradual process that eventually results in death. And the gradual process is an accumulation of dysfunction. So accumulation of changes and damage to our cells, to our molecules, and then eventually to our tissues, and then eventually to our entire organism. And when that change and damage constantly leads to gradual loss of function, but when that loss of function results in the failure of a critical system, then you get death. So there's a paradox, and that is while you're sitting here, thousands or possibly millions of cells in you are dying, okay, and you don't even notice it. In fact, in order for an organism to develop, cells have to die for it to develop properly. There's a phenomenon called apoptosis, which is programmed death. Now, that's one side of the equation. The other side is, at the moment, do you think you could stop? Hello? Stop that while you can do it at the end. Same with you, right? You can take a brief shot, and they're not going to change. It's just distracting. All right. So I said, while you're alive, millions of cells in you are dying all the time. You don't even notice it. And in fact, they're required to die often. Now, the flip side is when you die, most of your cells are still alive at the moment of death. Gradually, all your cells die. But at the moment of death, most of your cells are still alive. In fact, that's why you can be an organ donor. Your heart or liver or kidney can function perfectly well in somebody else. Now, so what do we mean then when we die? If we're dying, cells are dying all the time, and yet when we die, most of us are still alive. What we mean by death is the death of us as an individual, which is the ability to function as a coherent whole being. If we cannot do that, if that loss is irreversible, that's what we mean by death in this context.
I was curious about the genesis of the book, why we die. And you have explained in your introduction that this is the appropriate moment for a molecular biologist like you to look at our current understanding of aging and death. And there is this input, enormous amount of hype associated with death, which has led to widespread marketing of dubious remedies that have a highly tenuous connection with actual science. Yet they continue to flourish because they capitalize on our very natural fear of growing old and disabled and eventually dying. In fact, you say that in the last 10 years, more than 3 lakh scientific articles on aging have been published. Could you elaborate why this is the appropriate moment for you to write this book?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, as I pointed out, my own work has a peripheral connection with aging. In fact, the field itself is central to aging, but my own work is somewhat peripheral. But one thing is that for a long time, we knew about aging and dying. In fact, you could argue, and perhaps since you're an expert on primates and other mammals, we might comment on that. I believe that we may be the only species that's aware of mortality. Other animals are aware of death. For example, elephants, are known to mourn elephants that have died in their herd. But I don't think that other species are aware that there's a time limit. There's an expiration date. We know that none of us is going to live, at least given today's science and medicine, we're not going to live past 120 if we're extremely lucky, okay? And so we know that we have a lifespan, and that has somehow affected our thinking throughout the ages. In fact, you could argue that one of the purposes of religion is to help us cope with this idea of death that will no longer exist. Now, the point is that for a long time we could do nothing about it, but in the last 50 years, that critical moment where things are happening, lots of biology, that critical moment where things are happening, lots of biology is happening. Now, a lot of money is suddenly being poured into aging research. Why is that? It's because most societies in the West, and that's going to be true of India as well, most societies are getting older, and people are living longer. At the same time, fertility rates are dropping, okay? And in fact, in the south of India, you're already below replacement rate. Although India on the whole is, above replacement rate still, but you can blame Northerners for that. So the result is that you have societies with an aging population, but not the same number of young people to replace them, because fertility rates are dropping. So the fraction of people who are older is increasing dramatically, certainly in Western societies, as well as in the Far East, like Japan, Korea, they're at the forefront of this. Even China is becoming an aging society. And so there's a big need to ensure that this population stays healthy and independent and not act as a huge burden on the rest of society. So there's a lot of money going into aging research to improve health in old age. And this has also led to lots of companies investing. There's 700 companies with tens of billions of dollars invested in longevity research. Now these people are going to try and sell you stuff to make you, keep you healthy in old age and perhaps postpone old age. And so there's a lot of hype in the field. So I thought, many of the books in the field have been written either by journalists or they've been written by scientists who have some interest. They own a company, they're selling a product, they're selling advice, so they have certain vested interest. And so I thought it would be interesting for somebody like me who's close to the field but not inside it to take a hard look at the field. Okay? So that's a long answer, but I felt it was an important question.
You have given us the record holder, Jean Calment, who died in 1997 after living for 122 years. She lived in Arles, the town in southern France, where the Dutch painter Van Gogh lived near the end of his life. As of today, Calment has set the limit as 122 years. Tell us about this record as she provides a kind of backdrop to your book.
Yeah, there are all kinds of, every culture, and, for example, Judeo-Christian culture has Methuselah, who is supposed to have lived for hundreds of years, and we have in our own, in India, in Indian mythology, there's all these rishis who are supposed to have lived for hundreds of years. I actually met some guy in Tanjavur at the temple there who told me that this rishi had a combination of 64 herbs and that made him immortal. So I said, well, I was being polite, so I didn't say it, but what I thought was that, well, can you give me his mobile number? Because he's probably still around, right? So, anyway, but these are all, I would say, myths, okay? But the person, so for the longest living person for whom we have actual records, like birth records and a death date, is Jean Calment, who you mentioned, who lived to be 122. For most of her life, she smoked a cigarette and had a glass of port every day after lunch. Okay? And this is not something I would recommend. But she also ate a kilogram of chocolate a week. And that's something I could sympathize with as a chocolate lover. Anyway, but died in 1997 at the age of 122. And although the number of people living to be over 100 has gone up steadily in the last 30 years, nobody else has crossed even 120. They're all, the longest living people seem to die at sort of around 115 to 120. I think one person made it to 119, and then others were around 118 and so on. And that suggests that maybe we have evolved so that our natural limit the natural limit of our lifespan is about 120 years.
Venki, I would start with the first chapter of your book. It's such an interesting title, The Immortal Gene and the Disposable Body. I mean, it's a very catchy title. I'm just reminded of Bhagavad Gita. When Arjuna partners at the battleground, how can I destroy my family? And Krishna then giving his sermon, those who think themselves to be a slayer and those who think themselves to be slain are both without discernment. The soul slays not, neither is it slain. This would be the eternal truth if the word soul were to be replaced by the word DNA. So this would become immortal. So this, when you're talking about this, actually, you must read this chapter, very, very interesting chapter, that he gives so many analogies that people say, that the grandchildren, that these are my children, these are my grandchildren, but they are not us. Now, this is what I would like to ask you here, a technical question, because you also mentioned very interestingly, says, a daughter-in-law cannot increase her fitness through her mother-in-law, but a mother-in-law can increase her genetic fitness through her daughter-in-law. Now, this is a very technical sentence you have made. So I don't know why you missed it. The whole concept, strong concept of William Hamilton, the concept of inclusive genetic fitness, I think that would fit in so well here. So it may be a bit technical thing, but if you would like to explain the whole concept of genetic fitness in terms of inclusive fitness.
Yeah, so the whole idea of fitness is that evolution doesn't really care how long you live. Evolution does not select for longevity. So death is almost aging, and death is essentially a byproduct. It's not something designed or planned or selected for by evolution. And rather, evolution selects for fitness, which is the ability to pass on your genes. Okay. Now, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so you'll have to excuse me, but inclusive fitness is when, your fitness is interrelated to the fitness of others in the group, okay? And there is a certain problem with, most biologists don't like the idea of group selection, unless there's a strong genetic connection between elements of the group. So, for example, if you have a eusocial species like bees or wasps or ants, those individual members are all highly genetically related to each other. And so if you have a mutation that benefits a group, it will be selected for by the entire group because they're all genetically related. If you're not strictly genetically related in that sense of being almost like clones, then group selection doesn't really work. And actually, these people like Hamilton and actually Maynard Smith, John Maynard Smith, who convincingly argued against this. And the problem is that if you assume that aging and death occur because it's good for people to die so the next generation, children and grandchildren, can take over, and that would create a healthier species. There's a problem with that, which is that let's suppose that there's a genetic program that causes you to die early, or after a finite amount of time, to make way for a new generation. Now, what will happen is, if you have a mutation then in that gene that allows you to live longer, then you will produce more offspring. And so that mutation will then get selected for. And so a group selection algorithm will be unstable unless you have, very close kinship, almost sort of clonal kinship, like with ants or other use.
In the chapter entitled Destroying the Master Controller, I came across two interesting phenomena. You have frankly said that most scientists are so insular that they hardly appreciate what goes on outside their narrow specialities. Number two, another interesting observation you have made is that discoveries in science are not made in a vacuum. The state of knowledge reaches a stage where the next advances are possible. So new breakthroughs are often made simultaneously. I think we have some examples to illustrate this position, this phenomenon.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the second one first, which is, people think that there's some big stroke of genius.
Mr. Naganna, give your mic to Mr. Venki.
This may improve. We will exchange. Try this.
Okay. So the idea that scientists are these extraordinary geniuses that completely out of a vacuum make a new theory or a new discovery or advance. It's not strictly true, because if you look at even very big discoveries like calculus, you had hundreds of years when there was no calculus, and suddenly within the same lifetime, Leibniz and Newton discovered calculus. Even relativity was built on other things. People like Lorentz and others had started thinking about this idea of relativity. Although there, I would say Einstein went much further. And so, take the theory of evolution. Darwin worked on the theory of evolution by natural selection, and he didn't publish it. And then suddenly, he found some other guy in Malaysia, working in Malaysia, some British colonial fellow named Alfred Wallace, had come up with the same idea, okay? And so often biologists would refer to it as the Darwin-Wallace theory, although Darwin really made a much greater, much more detailed exploration of the idea than Wallace did. But still, two people had come up with the same idea at the same time. And so, why is that? And what I think is that science advances with lots of small discoveries and improvements in technology. And at some point, the state of understanding and the state of technology reaches a point where the next step is possible. Now, not everybody sees that the next step is possible, but often it isn't just one person. It's, a few people, or two people, or at least more than one person often sees that. And so you get this simultaneous discovery. And that was how, people didn't understand that DNA damage is constantly repaired. And that was relatively new. People thought, DNA damage occurs and then, eventually the cell dies. But actually, DNA damage occurs at such a dramatically high rate that all living systems have evolved very sophisticated mechanisms to repair the damage. And that idea of DNA damage repair was simultaneously observed by several people, and that's what I refer to.
Now, you have examined how Alexis Carrel's claim that the culture cells were immortal was disproved. Alexis Carrel's 1935 book, Man the Unknown, is very well known. In this book, you have recalled Carrel recommended sterilizing the unfit and gas chambers for criminals and insane. He did not stop at that. He went further and said that the Nordic people were superior to Southern Europeans. In 1936, the German edition of this book, he praised the Nazi government of Adolf Hitler for its new eugenics program. You have said very clearly Given Carroll's stature, it is quite possible that the Nazis used his remarks as one justification for their activities. If the scientists side with the strong and the powerful, it leads to disastrous consequences. Do scientists wear their prejudices on their sleeves or conceal it somehow for their survival, given the ruthlessness of the rulers?
I think, I've addressed this in my first book, Gene Machine, which is to say, science has a very beautiful system. It's based on evidence. It's largely self-correcting because if you make a mistake, other scientists are very eager to point out that you made a mistake. And so I already told you, we have not changed. We look the same as we did 15 minutes ago. We've not changed. We look the same. Okay, so just, you can finish this when the conversation is over, and you can do it. So science is a very beautiful system because it's based on logic, based on evidence, and it's self-correcting. But that doesn't mean that scientists are perfect. Scientists are highly flawed. They're like any other human being. They have egos, they have personalities, they have jealousies, but they're also kind. They can be altruistic, they can help each other, they can cooperate and collaborate. So the whole spectrum of behavior that you see in any walk of life will also be present in science, okay? But it's a system that keeps people honest, or keeps science honest. And so scientists will have flaws. Many scientists were eugenicists. At the time, they felt that they felt that was the truth, that, their race was superior. And, from a rational point of view, if you were in the 1930s, Europeans were at the top of the world. They dominated science, they dominated technology. So most Europeans it would be natural to think that they were superior, okay? And it's only a few people with really tremendous insight who would conclude that, this is due to various historical accidents, like the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, that resulted in the science, and Industrial Revolution happening in Europe. If the conditions had changed, it might have happened somewhere else. It might have happened in China or India or somewhere else.
I just can't help but ask you a technical question again, but I think you can just explain it in a very simple language because in this chapter, we have talked about the destruction of the master controller, for example, what we think is the DNA in the nucleus. But as you said, for example, we have the DNA, the genes in the mitochondria, and do they have a different frequency of mutation? Does it have a different consequence for aging? Because we have elaborated this, the whole mitochondrial activity, for example.
So, mitochondria are interesting. They're organelles in our cell. So that is to say that there are specialized compartments in our cells. And those mitochondria actually are remnants of bacteria. So mitochondria resulted from the fact that a large cell swallowed up a small bacteria a long time ago, 2 billion years ago. And normally that would have been a non-event. That is, the bacterium would have been swallowed up and digested and died, or the organism swallowing it up would have died because the bacteria would have killed it off. But in this particular case, the bacterium and the larger cell not decided, that's an anthropomorphic view, but it just so happened that they managed to live in a symbiotic fashion. And maybe it wasn't even that symbiotic at first, but it became symbiotic. And eventually, what has happened is mitochondria now are responsible for utilizing sugar as a fuel and converting that into a form that the body can use. So all of our energy from carbohydrates not all of it, but much of it is generated in mitochondria. And in addition to that, fat metabolism is related to mitochondria. A lot of metabolic pathways of the rest of the cell involve the mitochondria. So the health of the mitochondria has now become essential for the health of the cell. Now, I told you mitochondria originated from bacteria. Now, bacterial genomes have 1 million bases or so, and more. Like E. coli has about 4 billion bases, but even a small bacterium has many 100,000 bases. So bacteria have small DNA, but the mitochondrial DNA is very small. It only codes for 13 proteins in humans. And yet, those 13 proteins are essential for the mitochondrial health. And it turns out that these sophisticated repair mechanisms, I told you DNA gets damaged, and we have sophisticated ways to repair it. Those repair mechanisms exist in mitochondria also. But because mitochondria is a site where fuel is oxidized, you get these partial oxygen species which are very reactive. You know, it's the same way that your car, the inside of your car can rust, okay, due to oxidation. And because of that, the DNA of mitochondria can be damaged due to oxidation. It's also true that the process by which DNA is copied in mitochondria is more prone to errors than the DNA in our nucleus, the large piece of portion of DNA in our chromosomes. That's much better copied than the DNA in mitochondria. So for all these reasons, mitochondria tend to age, and perhaps faster than the rest of the cell, and they're a major driver of aging.
The publication of the draft sequence of the entire human genome was a historical moment. President Bill Clinton and British Prime Minister Tony Blair were lined up via satellite even as they were flanked by the world's most distinguished scientists. It was announced as another great Anglo-American partnership. You have quoted Clinton as saying, "Today we are learning the language in which God created life." My attention was particularly drawn to the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins' assessment of the Human Genome Project. He has said, along with Bach's music, Shakespeare's sonnet, and the Apollo space program, the Human Genome Project is one of those achievements of the human spirit that makes me proud to be human. Could you please explain the significance of this project, although it is well known in the domain of the science?
So, I mentioned to you that all proteins are made using instructions in our genes. And what those instructions are is basically the sequence of the letters that make up DNA. Each letter represents a building block called a base. And so the letters that make up the sequence of letters, the sentence, if you like, if you think of DNA as a very long sentence, what is the order of the letters that make up that sentence? That's what sequencing DNA is about. And if you don't know that order, then you don't know, first of all, you don't know what the protein that it codes for is going to be composed of. You don't know the signals that turn on the production of the proteins or that switch it off. You don't know how all of it is controlled. And so knowing that sequence is really the first step to understanding how genetic information is used, first of all, to build a body from a single cell, but then also to maintain life throughout its existence. So it was really a big landmark. And it doesn't mean that you solve biology by sequencing a genome. It's far from it. But what it does is it simply changes the level of understanding. Now you can start asking more detailed questions, more difficult questions.
Here, the same place you have once again talked about the lifespan. See, lifespan in an individual is one thing, but there is something in the nature code of the lifespan of a species as such. Again, I'm an evolutionary biologist, I can't help coming back. These processes, what we call R selection and K selection in nature. Certain species get selected to have very quick reproduction, spread as much as possible and die. And some of them have suicidal death, like bamboo death, for example, salamanders do. And some simply live long and reproduce occasionally and then simply die. And you have made a mention of this. Can you please elaborate on this a little bit, because this would be of a great interest to the audience.
So if you look at the lifespan of species, there are some insects which only live for one day. And butterflies, for example, live for maybe weeks. Okay? And at the other end, you have species that live hundreds of years. For example, Galapagos tortoises can live, the record is over 170 years, which means that there is a Galapagos tortoise around now that might have actually encountered Darwin when he was alive in the Galapagos Islands. So that's a striking, striking observation. And there are whales and sharks that live several hundred years. And so why is there this variation? And what I alluded to when you asked the question earlier is that evolution doesn't care about longevity, it only cares about fitness. Now, in the wild, resources are precious. For example, food. Humans have now somehow conquered this food problem. I mean, not everywhere. There are still people in poor countries who still have malnutrition and suffer starvation. But at least, let's say in the West or in prosperous countries, the food problem has gone almost the other way. In fact, obesity is a problem, not a thing. But for most of our existence and for most species, food is a problem. And so if you get food, you're metabolizing it into energy and resources, building materials. And the question is, where should you allocate your resources? So in order for a body to live long, you have to spend a lot of energy and a lot of resources for maintenance and repair. Okay? Now let's say you're a mouse. Would it pay for you to spend a lot of resources to maintain your body and repair it so that it ages very slowly and its natural lifespan will be 40 or 50 years? No, because long before that, the mouse would be eaten by a predator or die of starvation or something else, okay? And so, in the case of the mouse, there's no evolutionary benefit to selecting for longevity, okay? Rather, there's evolutionary benefit for selecting for very rapid growth and maturation and reproduction, so that you reproduce and die before you get eaten, okay, or before you die of other causes. And so evolution has selected a lifespan of about 2 years for a mouse. Now, at the other end, you have these very large animals which have very slow metabolic rates. And they can live for a long time. That gives them more time to select a mate. They have longer gestation periods, longer childhoods, all of these things. They live life in the slower lane. And so their evolution has selected for longevity. They select, they live, as I said, several hundred years. Now, an interesting thing that you might consider in support of this theory is that very often birds will live longer than terrestrially bound animals of the same size. And that's because birds can fly and they can avoid predators. And the other interesting thing is, even among mammals, the exception to the size rule are bats. Okay? And that's because bats can also fly, they can escape predation more easily, and they can also forage over a much wider area, so they're less likely to die of starvation because they can fly around over a much larger area for food. And so there are bats that can live up to 40 years, whereas a mouse of the same size or smaller or even larger only lives for about 2 years.
I get a signal that we have just 5 minutes at our disposal, and then we have
No.
I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit too long.
question and answer.
Yeah, we have a Q&A.
You can go on for next one.
Huh?
Next 11 minutes.
Okay. So, clearly you have poured all your wisdom into the last chapter. That's what I thought while going through it.
Yeah, somebody said to me, one of the comments on Amazon was that the molecular biology part is okay, but this Ramakrishnan dabbles in all this philosophy and sociology. He should stay in his lane.
But quite frankly, I like it immensely. So I have underlined all the sentences that I can detach this chapter and deliver it as an independent talk to on so many aspects like retirement age, anti-aging technologies, consequences of life extension, population issue, income inequality, delaying childbirth, so many issues. An entire conversation can be conducted solely on this chapter, I thought. But what arrested my attention is your conclusion that Nobel Prize winners nearly always make their breakthroughs when they are young and not very powerful. You have quoted Nobel Prize winning novelist Kazuo Ishiguro, who outraged his fellow writers by suggesting that most authors produce their best work when they are young. Your last sentence is worth its weight in gold. That is this: while we wait for the vast gerontology enterprise to solve the problem of death, we can enjoy life in all its beauty. When our time comes, we can go into the sunset with good grace, knowing that we were fortunate to have taken part in that eternal banquet. In fact, eternal banquet is our favorite metaphor. People join this banquet for a while and leave it making room for others. So that is your last observation, which I thought is very, very important and philosophical also.
Yeah, although I have to tell you, the California tech billionaires absolutely would hate it. Because they are determined to solve the problem of aging. You know, they don't, you know, I joke in the book that many of them are middle-aged men, often married to younger women. And so there's a strong incentive for them not to age.
There's a beautiful sentence he has written. When they were young, they wanted to be rich. And when they became rich, they wanted to be young. Okay, I have
See, these guys have actually read the book.
last question. I'm sorry, just being again an evolutionary biologist, I go back to the very title of the book. Why we die? You see, when we look at the life processes, there are two things. One is the underlying mechanism, and other is the evolutionary question of why. Underlying mechanism explains how.
Yes.
And the why question is actually evolutionary,
Yeah.
which I think has been.
But I do say that, to be fair, I do say that in the book. I say the answer to why in biology is always because evolution selected it. That's the only reason for it. But how that happens is a different question. You know? So you could say I could have written a book called How We Age, but unfortunately that title was already taken. But also my editors, you know, my original title was called Is Death Necessary? But I think my publishers found that a little too ambiguous and they didn't like it. So they basically said, this book is going to be called Why We Die, because it's punchy and, you know, catchy.
You know, again, once ago, why I was asking this was because the way I read it, Teach Aging, for example, you start with August Weismann in 19th century, when he said natural selection is a far more important force than any physiological mechanism to explain aging. And then Bill Hamilton, when he wrote about the evolution of senescence through natural selection. And then especially Michael Rose in 1990, when he wrote the book evolutionary biology of aging. And you have mentioned, for example, the plateau. Do we plateau in aging? And 2011 book, for example, by Larry Miller, Cassandra Rosser and Michael Rose, does aging stop? And you do mention this in your book.
Yes.
So this is an evolutionary perspective because its audience would like to know, if they read the book, they would know the underlying mechanism. But would you also like to enlighten them a bit about the very evolutionary perspective of aging?
Well, the evolutionary perspective is that, I pointed out that, you have this choice of resource allocation. So you want to select for rapid growth and maturation and allow animals to reach maturity and reproduce. That's really what underlies fitness. Now the problem is that often many of the things that will protect you early in life or help you grow fast early in life, help you mature early in life, or reproduce early in life, those same mechanisms will cause you to age. And this is the idea called antagonistic pleiotropy, which is things that are beneficial early in life will be selected for even if they're harmful and cause aging and eventually death later in life. And that's because this selection later in life is weak because you've already passed on your genes. So you're not selecting against those defects, later in life, but you're benefiting from their beneficial aspects early in life. And so that's the trade-off that occurs throughout this process.
There is a wonderful quotation in your book in the chapter 9 entitled "The Stowaway Within Us" from the biologist named Lynn Margulis. Though there is a humor in it, there is an element of pathos as well. Lynn Margulis was married to the astronomer Carl Sagan before marrying Thomas Margulis, a chemist whom she also soon divorced, and is quoted as saying, "I quit my job as wife twice. It's not humanly possible to be a good wife, a good mother, and a first-class scientist. No one can do it. Something has to go," she has said. Though Ms. Margulis doesn't say men are the culprits, is there a hint of it in her statement? Or in other words, how difficult it is for women scientists to scale the heights given the odds stacked against them?
I think, first of all, you have to realize two things. Lynn Margulis was a very eccentric character. I mean, she had a lot of crackpot ideas. For example, she didn't believe, I believe she didn't think HIV was caused by AIDS. She thought that the World Trade Center attack was a conspiracy. She had a lot of nutty, flaky ideas. But she happened to be right about one thing, about the symbiosis. But even there, my friend John McCutcheon, who's an evolutionary, who studies evolution of symbionts, says that she was not the only person or even the first person, but she was somebody who certainly wrote an influential paper about it. So I would, and also don't forget that she lived in different times. She lived, 40 or 50 years ago. And things have changed, certainly in the West, but I also see in India, I see, working class women riding motorcycles, going about their jobs in India. That would not have been true 50 years ago, okay? So I just think things are different now, and certainly in the case of my daughter or daughter-in-law, they both have active careers and children. So
Venki, one question which is not related to your book, but being a scientist, I cannot escape asking this question because you are an Indian. You know about India. You are working elsewhere,
Hold the mic.
and you are very familiar with.
although I have to tell you, I left India at 19.
Yeah, but you
I
come here often. You know about Indian science. You know about scientific institutions. So what do you
Only
think
a
about
few.
Indian science and Indian science scenario?
Okay, so this is going to get me into trouble. So I think there are a lot of very good Indian scientists, some of international caliber. But there are a couple of issues. The majority of Indian scientists are doing what I would call incremental work. That is, there'll be a field that exists and mostly pioneered somewhere else, and they will make contributions to it. Often they will go and do a postdoc or get a PhD from abroad. They'll come back and they'll keep working in that same area, and not breaking new ground. Now, part of it is because in the past, they used to be limited by resources. There were simply, there wasn't the equipment or the amount of money to launch a decent research program. But I think even in cases where now that's not true, like some of the bigger institutes and universities, there's still too much of what I would call standard mainstream research rather than, really focusing on something completely original and different. And I've often said that actually by tackling particularly Indian problems, for example, ecology or animal behavior in India, or pathology, diseases, environmental issues, energy issues, things which are really particularly related to India, you have the opportunity to do something original, but also world-class, okay? Because nobody else is doing it, and you might have that opportunity. Of course, that's easy to say, because the problem is it's very hard to think of a really original problem. I mean, you could argue that I've not done it. I postdoced on the ribosome, and I keep working on ribosomes, so perhaps I'm not the one who should talk.
In the chapter Aches, Pains and Vampire Blood, you gently warn the people to think of blood as an organ in the same way that we consider liver, kidney, heart and brain. You also refer to the idea of living forever by drinking young blood, which thinking has been around for a long time. Is it possible to replace old blood with young blood? According to you, Parabiosis attempts to do just that by surgically connecting the circulatory systems of two animals. What is the nature of the commingling of blood, and who profits in this exchange of young blood for old blood? Who actually profits in this exchange?
See, I think, well, the science is that when you connect two animals, an old animal and a young animal, and connect their circulatory systems so the blood flows from the young animal into the old animal and then comes back to the young animal. And so you get this joint circulatory system. Then the old animal benefits from the young blood, from the young animal. The young animal actually suffers. The young animal actually, only one of us should have it on.
No. One should be off at the time. When one is speaking, the other should be off. That's all. Yeah, that's fine.
So anyway, when this was done with animals, they found that the young animal suffered from the old blood of the older animal, and the older animal benefited from the young blood. So this suggested that there are factors that are different in young versus old blood, which are somehow related to aspects of aging. So scientists are trying to find out what these factors are and what they do. But the moment that this experiment was done, companies started sprouting up, typically in California, when people don't want to get old and die, and also have the money to do something about it. And so these companies would get blood from young donors and then extract the plasma and then inject it at $8,000 a pint to older people. And there was one famous case where a tech billionaire, Brian Johnson, actually did an experiment on himself and his family. He got blood from his son, who was 17 years old, and he was, I think, in his 40s. And then he gave blood to his father, so there's this intergenerational exchange. But he was also a fanatic about all these aging biomarkers, biological markers of aging, and he came to the conclusion that it wasn't really helping that much, and he stopped.
But we still get 49 tablets a day.
He spends $2 million a year on longevity. And I have to say, as a 48-year-old, he looks pretty good. But my son is 48. He looks fine.
That's good. There is a gentle humor pervading the entire book, and I'm tempted to quote one instance connecting Robert Ettinger, who founded the Cryonics Institute at Detroit, near Detroit. He had made more than 100 people to pay 20.
You have to explain what cryonics is. So cryonics is this idea that you can freeze a body in liquid nitrogen, okay? And the idea is, it's an act of faith. It's basically saying, eventually science will advance to the point where you can thaw out these people and bring them back to life, okay? That's the premise of the thing. I don't believe there's a shred of evidence. Okay. But anyway.
Yeah. This Robert Ettinger, he froze his mother Ria, first who died in 1977. His two wives were also stored there. You say with your characteristic humor, it is not clear exactly how happy they were to be stored next to each other. Or their mother-in-law for years and decades to come.
Imagine having to spend your entire eternity with your mother-in-law. That might be a tough job.
The body preservation, just a little humor. When there was an old Hindi movie in which the villain Ajit tells, no, इसे liquid oxygen में डाल दो, liquid इससे जीने नहीं देगा, oxygen इससे मरने नहीं देगा.
I think we are drawing to a close. Your language, vocabulary, and narrative technique and character sketch are so wholesome, the reader will be tempted to ask whether your memoir will be made available someday, if not in the immediate future. Your
Well,
memoirs.
I've written Gene Machine, which is not an autobiography. There's nothing there about growing up or my family or stuff like that. It's really about the race for the ribosome. So it's a sort of career arc and really more directed at the science history of the thing. So in that sense, it's a memoir, not an autobiography. There's a difference. A memoir is about a particular aspect of your life, typically about something to do with your work. I have no plans to write an autobiography because I think people, you have to be extraordinarily objective and to write something that's interesting.
I think there is space for one question from me, and then the audience will participate. We have written about the scientist Carlton Gajdusek, who had the unique, unfortunate distinction of being a Nobel Prize winner and a convicted child molester. The immunologist MacFarlane Barnett described Carlton Gajdusek as someone who had intelligence quotient up in the 180s and the emotional immaturity of a 15-year-old. He was awarded Nobel Prize in 1976, according to your book. In the 1990s, FBI began to investigate. Soon after his release, he left the US and went to Europe. You have written, he showed no remorse for his behavior, dismissing his treatment as American prudishness. There is a mismatch between the person's intelligence quotient and emotional maturity. You have also said that during his self-imposed exile, he stayed active scientifically and affiliated with several universities. How do we understand this discrepancy?
Well, you have to understand what happened with Carlton Gajdusek. He did his studies. He got the Nobel Prize for figuring out how the disease Kuru was transmitted. And he had that idea. Well, he wasn't the first person to have the idea, but he conclusively proved that it was because the Kuru tribe in New Guinea would often eat the brains and other parts of their ancestors when they died. And this was a part of somehow spiritually incorporating their ancestors inside by eating them, when they died. So by incorporating their ancestors into them. So it was a ritual. And so when, somebody must have had the original Kuru disease, but what happened is when people ate it, they came down with Kuru disease, which means there was a transmissible ingredient that survived, digestive tract and, eventually entered your circulation and so on. So he got the Nobel Prize for this. When he went back to the US, he brought a number of Kuru children to educate them in the US. He thought that was something that he'd do. And it turns out that Kuru might have practiced a kind of pedophilia that we would consider completely abnormal. And he clearly did that while he was educating them. But it's a little complicated because even afterwards, many of those children stayed on very good terms with him. Many of them named their own children after Carlton Gaiderschek, So it's something we would consider really aberrant and not something that we should tolerate. But clearly he lived in his own sort of philosophical and moral universe.
That takes us to the end of our task, as far as I and Dr. Deva Singh is concerned. Now, who will take over? Question and answer.
Any questions?
Here it is, ma'am. Ma'am.
Take that.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, now I have hearing aids, so you have to use the mic and you have to speak loudly and slowly and clearly.
As per
You don't have a mic, I can't hear you.
Take the mic.
Namaste, Venki and the organizers. I am really thankful to the organizers for having given this opportunity of a matter with which we are greatly interested. The question is, in Eastern, that is Indian concept about life and death, is associated with 5 elements. What is the role of these elements in deferring death?
What elements?
5 elements. In India, we say
Vayu,
Panchabhutagalu.
Please
Earth,
hold the mic close to your mouth.
earth, sun, water,
Yeah.
air.
Look, I think science has moved a long way beyond thinking of biology in terms of
Professor Venki, now that you are working on the frontiers of science, on the macrocellular structure, the building blocks of the human body, will this lead to any breakthrough medicinal or even the structural changes will prevent diseases like Parkinson's disease, cerebral palsy, or
that is the goal of, so this is an interesting concept, which is, people ask, is aging a disease or is it just a natural process? And there's a debate about that, because if you look at many of the reasons we die in old age, like cancer, the 4 big ones are cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and dementia of very, neurodegenerative diseases. All of those 4 diseases have the risk factor goes up with age. So there is a view that aging is the underlying disease, And these are secondary manifestations of aging. And so if you were able to solve aging, you would delay the onset of these diseases and effectively prevent them. So there is the possibility that by fundamentally working on the fundamental mechanisms of aging and allowing more healthy aging, you also prevent the onset of these diseases. The question is whether you would then die without getting those diseases, or whether you would simply postpone them and eventually you would get them later on. That's not clear. You mentioned Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases. It turns out that the brain is actually one of the hardest organs to treat, and part of it is we don't quite understand the mechanism by which some of these protein aggregations lead to death, or whether they're even the primary cause of death. Or, so there could be a sequence of events in which protein aggregation is an important component. So we don't know really how to target these things particularly well. And that's why they're not very effective cures for these neurodegenerative diseases. I think that's going to be the hardest problem to solve, personally.
Sir, I have two questions, sir. One is related to antioxidant and calorie restriction, and also telomerase length. What is the role of these things on aging, sir, overall?
You mean caloric restriction?
Yes. And also telomerase length.
Sorry, what?
Telomere length.
Oh, telomere length, yeah. So let's talk about telomere length first. So it turns out our DNA exists as a linear molecule, so it's got a finite length. And each time that DNA is copied, it becomes a little shorter. This is because the copying mechanism cannot copy the ends completely. Now, when we're young, certainly when the cell is developing from a fertilized egg, we have an enzyme called telomerase, which adds extra sequences to the ends of the chromosomes. And so that compensates for the shortening, because then you get lengthening due to this enzyme called telomerase. But as we get older and our cells get differentiated, they lose active telomerase. And so the telomeres, that is the ends of our DNA, keep getting shorter and shorter. At some point, that leads to the cell going into a state called senescence, or even cell death. And so that's a cause of aging. Now the problem is that one reason we might have lost telomerase is because we don't want these cells to have the ability to multiply indefinitely, because we want to minimize the risk of cancer. And so it may have evolved as a cancer prevention mechanism that allowed us to reach maturation without getting cancer. But the side effect, which evolution, as I said, doesn't select against, is that it causes aging later in life. The second thing you mentioned is also an important thing, which is caloric restriction. It's been shown in many species that if you restrict the number of calories in its diet, then that animal resembles a younger animal and often lives longer. And of course, there is a particular flaw in these studies in that they usually compare animals that can eat all they want with animals that are calorically restricted. And so some people have argued that, well, all you're saying is that stuffing yourself full of calories is bad for you, and that's not how we would exist normally in the wild. But nevertheless, there is an effect of calories on our aging and metabolism. And so there is a movement to try and understand what are the biochemical pathways that are affected by caloric restriction, and can we use drugs to mimic the effects of caloric restriction and thereby do that. And there are some candidates like rapamycin, which many anti-aging advocates study.
One more thing, sir. Professor Naganna asked the
Maybe we
same
should
thing.
ask somebody else.
Same thing regarding.
Hello, sir. Sir, there is a lot of fake news on the internet regarding longevity.
Or anything else, actually.
Yeah. So, which place do you think that we can get authentic information about longevity of life?
I think it's a complicated problem because even very serious scientists, often have an agenda. As I said, many of them own companies, they're marketing products and so on. But I would say, if you look at mainstream sort of science magazines, like Scientific American or Quanta magazine, which is free and online, many of those will have articles about longevity that are, reasonable and not full of hype.
What do you think is the do's and don'ts that we should do for longevity, your personal?
Well, I mean, the three things I advocate in the book is hardly new. It is to eat moderately, exercise, and get enough sleep. And the three things interact with each other. So, for example, exercise will help you sleep, and vice versa, and they also will help you with diet. And so those three things currently are better than any medicine for anti-aging. But that doesn't mean that there won't be in future something really useful.
Dr. Venki, you were talking about mitochondria and how they age faster than the rest of the body. So I want to ask you, the mitochondria goes from the mother to the child during birth. How does the child not get aged mitochondria? How does the child get young mitochondria?
That's a very interesting question. It's actually it's a very thoughtful question, and this also has to do with the fact that why is it that every child born is born at age 0? Because it's coming from eggs and sperm, which are quite old, right? So why is it that with each generation the child isn't getting older? And even a more interesting fact is, why is a child born to a 40-year-old woman not 20 years older than the child born to a 20-year-old woman? They both have the same life expectancy. Okay? And this is because there's a huge amount of selection going on. So cells, eggs, for example, or sperm with defective mitochondria won't be able to swim and compete with healthier sperm, in order to fertilize the egg. And similarly, eggs go through the oocytes when they go through selection and eventually end up, as eggs for ovulation. They also go through a huge stringent selection process. So if there are defective mitochondria, those cells are weeded out.
Sir, Dr. Gopal Singh. The combination of ribosomes and proteins with bonding element amino acid maintain a balance. Will it also affected by the mental stress and emotional aspects of psychological thinking?
No, I didn't quite understand the question, but if you're saying the stress, so first of all, the brain and the rest of the body interact in hundreds of ways. There are all these chemical messengers, hormones, which affect both ways. Thinking can affect your heart rate, it can affect, it can affect your immune system. If you're depressed, you have worse immune system. And vice versa, hormones and even visual perception can affect your brain and your thinking process. So the brain is not separate really from the rest of the body. And it turns out that stress actually is one of the things that can accelerate aging. And the mechanisms are not completely clear, but certainly hormones are released due to stress. Sorry, just sneeze. So hormones hormones are released due to stress, and these can affect metabolism and aging, etc.
I have a question.
I have a mic. Thank you very much for that very erudite and warm lecture, sir. I'm a clinical microbiologist and I read your book as a right to enter this hall. And as I read your book, I was consumed with the feeling that the field of anti-aging has many an eccentricity, like Dr. Gray, who headed the very prestigious Sense organization, the tall claims of the Sinclair company, and the millionaire now who is touring our country and he wants to die, establish a cryonics unit there. So I feel all this is luring the young and the old, and it is not in sync with what is generally prescribed for aging, and that is acceptance, peace and tranquility. I just want to know what you feel about the tug of interest between those who don't want to die and those of us who don't want to be born or reborn, as I would say.
So I think, this is a complicated question. The reality is, most of us don't want to die, okay? We will want to die only when we're very old and, really miserable and things look terminal. Then we might reluctantly accept death. But we don't, sincerely, we don't actually accept death, okay? And I'll tell you, I'm on anti-aging medicines right now as we speak. For example, I'm taking pills for my high blood pressure. I'm taking statins for my cholesterol. And if I become diabetic, I'm sure I'll take medicines for diabetes. Why am I taking that? Well, I want to stay healthy longer, okay? I don't want to die prematurely of a stroke or heart attack and so on. So if somebody were to come to you tomorrow and said, look, thanks to modern science, we now have a drug, this pill, that if you take it every day, it will give you 10 years of healthy life. Nobody wants 10 years of miserable life. But if they tell you, this will give you 10 years of healthy life, extra healthy life, most of us would take it. I mean, that's just the reality. And so there's a slight conflict between what is necessarily good for society and what's good for individuals. And, it's not good for society for, people in Delhi or Bangalore, or I don't know about Mysore, but certainly Delhi and Bangalore. It's not good for society for everybody to drive around in cars, okay? And yet, if they have the chance to have a car and drive around, they'll do it, okay? And so that's just, because they get an individual benefit. Then they don't have to be walking on the streets and breathing polluted air. They can sit in their air-conditioned vehicle and avoid the problem while actually contributing to the problem. Right? So there's always this dichotomy between what the individual wants and what's good for society.
I'd like to ask a question. When I read the title of your book, Why We Die, the simplest answer that came to my mind was, we die because we were born. It happens. And definitely the major factor is aging. But besides that, definitely aging is a factor. And human body is a wonderful machine. It knows how to repair itself, and it does do. But what I would like to know is that a lot of deaths happen in infancy and even stillbirths. What can be the cause of that?
Well, those are not what I would call inevitable, okay? Because not everybody dies of stillbirth. Not everybody dies of infancy. And indeed, not everybody dies of a heart attack or cancer. So, in a way, the kind of death I'm talking about as a result of aging is different because it's inevitable. Now, your first point about we die because we're born, that is true, but it doesn't explain why there are species that effectively age very, very slowly. There are even species which are, some people consider biologically immortal, like a species of jellyfish or hydra. which constantly regenerate themselves. I think if you followed an individual hydra or jellyfish for long enough, you would find it too would age and eventually die. But they die long before that of other causes. And so the real puzzle is not, the fact we're born and therefore we have to die, but why does it have to happen at such different rates? And can you do something about those rates? Can you postpone it? Could you live 300 years or 500 years instead of 100 years? So that's the
Thank you. Yeah. Hi. I have a mic now. My question is more around what the future looks like, and you are like you mentioned, the scientific community is kind of aware of what big idea is coming up next, or they are kind of all working on those things, in cohesion or maybe separately. So are there any such, because I have a 5-year-old, I need to know where to put in life. So, no, I'm just kidding, but the point is, what are the next big ideas in science that are really going to change the world? And, CRISPR-Cas9 was one of them, I think, and, Demis has
obviously, I don't, science is unpredictable, so you can't really, Richard Feynman said, if he knew what the big ideas were in physics, he would be working on them. And and of course, I'm at the tail end of my career, so I can't really tell you. I think you would have to ask somebody who's 35 or 40, what they think the next big ideas are. Because I think we pointed out that people are really very creative when they're young.
Excuse me.
One second.
I'm sorry. I'm just curious about, you went from physics to molecular biology.
Yeah, that's not as big a leap as I think was made out in the introduction. There are lots of physicists, including Francis Crick, Max Delbruck, who was a big phage geneticist, Max Perutz, who founded the institute where I work. Many physicists have made that transition from physics to biology, so it's not that unusual.
Sir, whether SNPs contribute to the longevity process?
Sorry, what?
Single nucleotide polymorphisms, do they contribute to longevity?
I don't know. They might give you some sort of resilience, but to be honest, I haven't thought about it. I've not actually encountered that as a factor in longevity in my readings, but the real answer is I don't know.
I also have one more question, sorry. Somebody was asking that where do we get authentic information from on longevity? But there are also very famous journals from whom the publications have been retracted. So what are your comments on that?
But that's, I think retractions are just a normal part of science. People, partly because science is so competitive, people will often publish in a hurry. Sometimes they publish because they actually are convinced that what they're publishing is correct. And later on they find a flaw, either sometimes it's fraud and deliberate error, but sometimes it's just a flaw in their experimental logic, and then they realize that their paper is actually wrong, and then they retract it. I'm not so concerned about that. That's part of the self-correcting nature of science.
Excuse me, sir. So myself, I'm Vinay Kumar NK. So I'm Vinay. My name is Vinay. I'm basically a software developer. So I pitched in here into this event just with the title which you have in the book, which is Why We Die. Okay. So before that, while you conversing with the other colleagues who are in the stage, you said the title, earlier you had a title called as Isn't Death Necessary? So that was your previous title, right? So based on this, I had just 2 questions which I usually ask my mom from childhood. So whenever we see an organism, so if you consider human and the longest living creature, something like banyan tree, Oh, okay, yeah. So banyan tree, okay. So to make it short, like banyan tree can live longer. Why can't humans? Can we compare?
Yeah, so tree plants are a little bit like Hydra or the jellyfish in that they have stem cells distributed throughout their body, and so they can regenerate. Okay, so for example, there's a tree in Cambridge, which is a cutting of the apple tree that Newton sat under, in his home in Lincolnshire, and was brought to Cambridge, and it grew into a separate tree. So the question is, which is a real tree? So it's different for what I would call organisms that can be defined as an individual, and which don't just regenerate like plants. So the real question is, why do whales or certain sharks live for several hundred years, and we live only for, say, 80 to 100 years? And that's the evolutionary theory that we discussed several times.
Sir, hello sir. Sir, actually, hello sir, I'm here. Sir, actually, my name is Aditya, sir. Sir, actually, sir, till now, structural biology had solved some of the hardest problems in science. We all know that human consciousness is one of the toughest problems in science. In the year 2018, a paper was published in the Neuroscience Journal by two scientists, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff. They stated that they have given a mechanism called as orchestrated objective deduction, which states that the human consciousness might arise from some type of quantum fluctuations inside the microtubules of the neurons. So, by using these structural biology techniques, by applying to these microtubules, can we solve the problem of consciousness ultimately by curing?
I doubt it very much, because the structural biology will look at structures of individual molecules, and this is really about a kind of network effect between lots of neurons that leads to consciousness. By the way, I should say, many people consider Penrose's theory of the mind somewhat wacky. This is an example of a mathematical physicist dabbling in a field without really, understanding sort of the biology of it. So I don't. He's a brilliant guy.
Yes, sir. He was an Nobel Prize also.
Yeah, he's a brilliant guy. I mean, he's far more brilliant than I am.
Yes,
but it doesn't mean that he's a good biologist or a neuroscientist.
And sir, if this theory will be proven in the future, can we cure death ultimately by storing our consciousness?
That's, this idea is called the transhumanist idea, which is that you simply take your consciousness and somehow digitize it and store it in a computer. Did you say you're a software guy? No, that was the other thing. You store it in a computer and then you immortalize your consciousness. Well, there are several things wrong with it. One is the brain doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists as with chemical interaction with the rest of the body. So it's not going to be the same in isolation. And then you have a peculiar paradox. Let's say somebody did that to you. They dumped you in a computer and that's now your consciousness. What's to prevent somebody from copying that and creating, say, 5 Adityas? Which one is a real one? And which one has a real consciousness? Okay? So you see the paradox there. It's not the same as the consciousness of an individual.
The recent study research shows that the Y chromosome started to disappear in the human. Is there any possibility to replace the Y chromosome by another new chromosome?
That may happen evolutionarily. Do you know of cases where the sex chromosome is migrated from one chromosome to another? Yes. Yeah. Right. So we, a lot of the sex-determining genes are, for example, there's the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. Now, if you were to take and migrate it to some other chromosome, then that chromosome would become the sex chromosome. There are all sorts of weird things happening, but it's not my field, okay, so I can't tell you.
Hello, sir.
You spoke about many youths and younger
Sorry?
You spoke about the younger generation spending their entire lives on incremental studies rather than finding and working on groundbreaking discoveries. So how would you encourage the youth today to find that spark in them and encourage them to go for the groundbreaking studies?
It's a very difficult problem, and it has to do with tradition of mentorships. You know, for example, the institute I work has produced over 18 Nobel laureates, and it's not a very big institute. I would say in size it's probably smaller than the University of Mysore, for example. Okay, so the question is why is that? And I think what it is to work on a hard original problem is difficult, and I'll tell you that in a non-trivial way. One is there are a lot of problems which are premature. They may be very fascinating and original, but they're premature because we haven't reached the level of understanding, or we don't have the tools or technology to address the problem. So they're not worth tackling right now, you know. And I think consciousness may be one of those, although there are people working on it. The other is that when you tackle a hard problem that's worth tackling, often things don't work right away. Now, things don't work all the time in science. So the question is, every day you have to make a decision. Do I continue working on this problem, or do I work on something else? Or do I continue working on this problem the way I'm approaching it now, but simply keep trying, or do I change my approach? Okay? So these are not things for which there is some recipe book that you can follow. Okay? These are things that you learn from mentorship. So if you have other people who have tackled hard problems, they will say, oh, you know, actually, I think this is not worth doing, or you change your approach. Or they'll have networks, you know, they'll say, hey, I was at a meeting where I heard this person give a talk which might help you with your problem. So there's all sorts of things that allow people to succeed in tackling hard problems. How to nucleate that in a place that doesn't have it is really hard. So you need one or two really good people who stay there and kind of foster people first in their area, and then that'll act as a magnet to attract other people.
Hello, sir. This is about one question. Nano, one material